The TNT Shop has great gift ideas for your furry family member. And we don't mean your Aunt Dolores.
You stink!
The TNT Shop has it all at TNTRadio.live. Joseph Arthur and his Technicolor Dreamcast on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome to the Joseph Arthur Technicolor Dreamcast. Shane Watson is a public speaker and mental health educator who's spent the previous 9 years working in youth, mental, and behavioral health and wellness. He's performed over 600 speaking engagements at schools, corporations, conferences, and done more than 100 local and national media interviews, including appearances on the Today Show, Good Day New York, and Kansas City Live. Shane speaks on topics including addiction and recovery, suicide prevention and intervention, depression, healthy technology use, and more. As a professional, a parent, and an individual who faced his own mental health challenges in the past, he is passionate about using his experience to help people thrive and succeed. On the 29th of this month, he will celebrate 11 years sober. Congratulations on 11 years sober, Shane, and unless, of course, you blow it before the 29th. I'm kidding. Thanks for coming on, Shane. How's it going?
Thank you so much, Joseph. You know what? I think I'm going to make it to that date. I appreciate you sharing your time with me. I'm glad to be here.
You're going to make it, man. That's how I felt comfortable to make the joke. It's not like you're celebrating 2 months. If you were celebrating 2 months, I wouldn't have made that joke. I'd have said, you can do it. Remember Rob Schneider in those Deuce Bigalow movies, or where Adam Sandler, you can do it. Anyway, what's going on, man? I just read this article this week about kids' suicidal ideation spiking something like 50-something%. I can't remember the exact percentage. I think it was 59% increase. Hospitalization visits from kids with suicidal ideation. And what's causing this in your view?
You know, we have seen an increase in suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, suicide completions over the last handful of years. This has been steadily increasing as it is. But looking at more recent years, if we look at the last couple years since COVID started, when we had the lockdowns and kids lost a full year of in-person schooling, their extracurriculars were shut down. They didn't get to walk at graduation. They didn't get to play their sports, and they were disconnected from their in-person support networks. That right there took a fire that we already had, the proverbial fire of the mental health epidemic in this country, and it threw gasoline on that fire. And there were some of us that when those lockdowns were coming, I knew plenty of colleagues in the field of mental health who were saying, ooh, we got to really be careful with this because this could create a whole new series of problems. So in the most recent years, it's a result of the lockdowns and the disconnection. If we move back just a little bit earlier than that, if you look around 2011, 2012, when smartphones really started taking off, and you look at the graph that shows that upward swing, that curve of cell phone use, app use, social media use, you can overlay that with the upswing in youth suicide attempts, ideation, completions, etc., and they will mimic each other. Now, some people may say, okay, that's correlation. It doesn't necessarily mean causation. But we do see some causation from the negative effects of technology as well.
I was just listening to Megyn Kelly on a run earlier today, and she was doing a piece on men and jobs and how joblessness amongst men who aren't even looking for jobs is way, way, way up. And when they talk about what they're doing with their time, they're not helping around the house. They're not doing any sort of volunteer work or anything. What they say they do is spend time staring at screens. And it made me think like, wow, this is like the zombie apocalypse being ushered in by a combination of pharmaceutical drugs, weird injections, and just a screen takeover of everyone's life. So what you're saying here about the kids, I think it's spreading beyond the children as well. I mean, if you're a person that doesn't have a real sense of purpose and drive in your life or some kind of spiritual connection, this is a dark world to find yourself in.
That's absolutely true. And that's a big part of what we're seeing is people, whether we're talking about youth or we're talking about adults, lacking purpose and lacking connection. Through social media and technology and smartphones, we are more connected, and I'll put the word connected in quotes, than we have ever been. Yet we are more disconnected as a society, as humanity, as perhaps we have ever been, if not, easily the most we've been in several years. And people are chasing after likes. They are wanting that attention, that validation on social media. And this applies to adults as well. They're chasing that dopamine hit from the likes, the comments, the subscribers. Some of these apps are even designed to act in a way like slot machines do, with things like pull to refresh, where you're constantly refreshing your feed to get that novelty, that alert, that sound, that picture, and it's behaving like a drug in the brain. Now, you pair that with someone, as you said, who doesn't have a job or a calling or a career or a mission, and they are becoming addicted to something that's behaving like a drug in the brain, and they are not at the end of the day saying, I have served a purpose today. You combine that with, as you said, psychotropic drugs and other weird situations that are going on in society right now. No kidding that we have the situation that we have right now.
And the fentanyl crisis, plus with it's not just social media, let's face it, porn is huge on the internet, and that's another massive dopamine spike. So people can just go between that, social media, video games, then news feed, Twitter, where they can get engaged in troll-like behavior and battles there. I mean, it's a mess. If you're framing your life that way, which, the gravity of life in our current world will pull you in that direction in the absence of purpose or any kind of spiritual connection. It's how do people escape that? If people are aware that they're in that sort of black hole, that technological black hole, how do they get out of it?
I'm a huge advocate for people supporting one another. It's important for anyone out there, maybe somebody that's listening to this, or just people in general who are struggling with technology addiction or pornography addiction or any unsafe or unhealthy behavior, for them to recognize they are not alone in what they're dealing with. There is help available. And it's especially refreshing when that help comes from someone who can tell them, I lived that. And that's actually why I got into the field of mental and behavioral health, because as you mentioned in my introduction, I'm an individual in long-term recovery. I'm somebody that struggled with a suicide attempt. I'm somebody that struggled with drug and alcohol addiction. And it's important for people to get connected with someone who is willing, ready, and able to help them, someone who is non-judgmental, someone who is empathetic. And if you can add in that bonus of someone who has lived it and since overcome it and is in healthy, active recovery, the moment that they sit down with that person who says, yeah, I used to go through that myself, that individual who's struggling realizes immediately they are not alone. And you know what? The moment you realize you're not alone, that is when healing begins. So what we need to do is not isolate. Unhealthy and unsafe behavior thrives in isolation. Seek someone out. Get connected. Tell someone, a family member, a friend, one of your faith leaders, or get connected with professional help. But it's important to take that first step and recognize this is not serving me well. I need to do something about it.
So you attempted suicide how many years ago? Was that how you ended up getting in recovery?
November 28th, 2011. So that's the day before what I count as my sober date. And it was at the tail end of 20 years of substance use, a lot of really harming relationships with my behavior, loss of thousands and thousands of dollars, which is one of the least important things in this story, loss of time that I knew I would never get back, and then loss of what I felt like was potential. And finally, on top of all that, on top of losing 6 family members in a 4-year period, on that last night, I drank or used, behaved violently. And I remember I was in blackout for most of the night, but those few moments that I do recall, I remember the moment where it sank in. This is what I've turned into. And I remember thinking to myself, it's over. I'm done. And that is when I attempted to end my own life. And thank God I didn't end my own life, because number one, we wouldn't be having the conversation we're having right now. I wouldn't have had the chance to do what the organization I worked for, Not My Kid, an incredible organization, gave me the chance to do for 9 years. And most importantly, I wouldn't be the dad of an amazing, beautiful, intelligent, strong, incredible little girl named Anna Grace, who's coming up on 10 years soon. So that's a long answer to your question. Is that what got me started? Yeah, that night and waking up in jail the following day.
And if you don't mind going into it a little bit, how did you attempt to take your life?
Well, interestingly enough, that is also why I am a convicted felon. I behaved violently earlier in the evening, and then there was about 45 minutes that elapsed in between that and my suicide attempt, and it involved a firearm. The officers that responded to the incident charged me under an Arizona law that's called Shannon's Law. It's named after a young lady who was killed by random gunfire when somebody went outside and just fired a gun up into the air, and that bullet's got to come down somewhere. What they did is my suicide attempt, which was done within my own home, was charged under Shannon's Law. So I am a convicted felon. I have a permanent felony for unlawful discharge of a firearm in city limits. I've lost my rights as an American citizen, and the state that I live in does not have an expungement statute. So even though I'm coming up on 11 years clean and sober, and I have gone 180 degrees from the direction I was going in before, that is something that I will continue to carry with me for the rest of my life.
Well, man, it's a good trade for the recovery that you've pulled off, and it's miraculous that you are as, together as you seem to be. I mean, just in setting up this interview, you're so on top of, if everyone, not to call out anyone else, but you have just been so great to communicate with, and just, man, you have a sort of military-like responsibility and ethic I can just sense in the little bit of exchanges I've had with you. What was early recovery like, and what happened to you to bring this kind of grace onto yourself?
You used the exact word. It's grace, and I'll get farther into why that's the key word here in a moment. My early recovery, the day after the last time I drank or used, I woke up in Durango jail, part of the Maricopa County detention system, a place that's loud and crowded and chaotic and violent and insane. And because of my suicide attempt, I was in a psych pod in part of what was at the time Sheriff Joe Arpaio's system, which was a notorious system at the time. And spent the first few days, sweating, shaking, vomiting, going through withdrawals in my cell, and thinking that I had lost everyone and everything good in my life because of my actions. And I remember thinking to myself, I will do anything to get those people back. I will do anything to not be this person anymore. Now, I've had a personal faith for most of my life, but for a number of years, I was not really walking the walk. When I was in Durango jail, a few days into it, another inmate that was in there, a guy by the name of Troy, had a spare Bible, and I was like, man, can I get that from you? And we had informal Bible studies in our pod, and just poured myself back into my faith. Not quite a week into my time there, we had a church service, and it was oddly enough done by a pastor, a guy named Pastor Walt, who runs something in Phoenix called Church on the Street. Now, I had been involved with Church on the Street previously when I had helped a nonprofit called Boundary Breakers take clothing donations down to them. But here I am, and there's Pastor Walt, and he's like, now I see this guy on the other side of everything. So he invited me to come stay with him and move into a place in Phoenix called the Phoenix Dream Center. It's a place where people who are moving out of jail and prison, survivors of human trafficking, ex-gang members can move in and learn to live with integrity and with faith. And while I was there and not drinking and not using, good things started happening for me again. I started laughing again. I started having hope again. I began to gain back people's trust and my self-respect. And as I said, what started with that Bible in Durango, I just continued to lock that in. And I was there for about 60, 70 days because I had a no contact order. I was not allowed to come home because of the way that I behaved. Well, word got back to my wife, hey, he's changed. Like, I know that you've heard a million times from this guy over 20 years, over several years of marriage, that he's sorry and no changes accompanied it. But word got back to her, no, you got to see him. This guy is different. So she wrote to the judge, she called the judge, and she said, I want him to come home. And the judge, I had one of my appearances I had to make in court, and he said, I don't do this. But your wife is very persistent, and I'm going to let you move home. And I moved home, and that's where that word grace that you mentioned comes in. You know, the pain from jail and the pain from feeling that loss and the withdrawal and thinking I had lost all those great people, that lit the fire. But what locked it in is the grace that I received when I came home, when my wife said, I still love you. Now, you're going to have to prove it to me that things are different, but I still love you. And my parents said, yeah, you messed up. You messed up big, but we love you. And I was surrounded by family and friends and people that said, we're here for you. And you know what? It clicked this time. And that's why I'm coming up on 11 years, because of the grace of Jesus Christ and because a lot of love and forgiveness from those around me.
That's a great story, Shane. We'll be right back with more from Shane Watson after these words on TNT.
Trish Wood on TNT Radio.
I am not one of those people who's afraid to be an election denier. I don't think American elections technically function particularly well, especially being someone in Canada, where we don't have the same kind of mail-in ballot hijinks that they do down there. I mean, it's come to the point in America now where the Democrats are pushing for more and more and more ways to vote that are less and less and less secure. And originally, obviously, that was because they were using COVID-19 as the reason and the mechanism for pushing this Wild West mail-in ballot idea. Of course, that's gone now, but if anybody wants to give it up, I know DeSantis kind of got rid of it in Florida, and they had the votes counted in about 15 seconds down there. But if you want to tighten it up, you'll be accused of trying to stop people from voting. I mean, they've got every single talking point, right? If you notice a problem, you're an election denier. If you question climate science, you're a climate science denier. I mean, it's a country and part of really the Western world, because we all suffer from the drumbeat of constant legacy media propaganda, but nowhere is it more obvious and more destabilizing than in what just happened to our brothers and sisters south of the border.
Trish Wood on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Affordable housing, we can build that. Sustainable housing, we can build that. At MIT Modular, we understand the importance of housing for all and the importance of design, cost, and functionality. Our goal is to meet the needs of our growing population by converting shipping containers to livable units. If you're like-minded and in a position to invest in something meaningful and life-changing, we want to hear from you. We are a team of professional architects, engineers, and financial and tax experts dedicated to offering unique solutions that provide a brighter future. Our Opportunity Zone Fund offers investors both real estate and operating business diversification, 5-year tax deferral on capital gains, annual tax benefits, and ultimately tax-free appreciation potential. There are opportunity zones all over America. If you're interested in learning more about our services, need affordable housing, or want to participate in creating a new vision for tomorrow, give us a call in the U.S. on 385-985-5702. Or read more at mitmodular.com. MIT Modular. We can build that.
Why listen to TNT Radio? Because friends don't let friends listen to mainstream media. Today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
Welcome back to Joseph Arthur's Technicolor Dreamcast, here in conversation with Shane Watson, who is about to celebrate 11 years and does a lot of work, service and otherwise. So you've done some news appearances, like the Today Show and Good Day New York, Kansas City Live. What was the occasion of that, Shane?
All three of those were related to youth substance use prevention. And it was basically about giving parents tips to prevent their kids from using substances, or to know what to look for, to know if their child was already dealing with those things. Because as much as I am a huge advocate for recovery and for helping people who are already facing these challenges, if we can prevent an individual from going down that path to begin with, especially if we're talking about kids, that sets us up for success. A large percentage of people who later go on to struggle with addiction and or alcoholism started using alcohol or drugs prior to adulthood. And that can really set somebody up for a higher likelihood of addiction. As a matter of fact, the earlier the age of onset, the higher the likelihood that somebody will struggle with addiction later in life. And so those three interviews in particular, those were all substance use prevention related. Plenty of those other interviews had to do with suicide prevention or bullying, safe social media use, self-injury prevention, and things like that. Those three had to do with giving parents the tools they need to keep their kids from using drugs and alcohol.
That's my story as well. I actually started going into recovery before I even was of legal age. I got after it pretty young and lived an adult life in high school. I was a musician playing 5 nights a week in Cleveland bars, so it was easy for me. They would always give me rum and cokes because it looked like I was just drinking Coke, but I was getting hammered. So a lot of people get into recovery and then you go through all the 12 steps, and the 12th step is all about service and building esteemable feelings within, so that it makes psychological sense. If you have self-respect, if you're being of service, and it goes back to what we were talking about with finding purpose. It's kind of like an innate purpose that you receive when you go into those recovery places, 12-step and whatnot. It's kind of one of the gifts if you do it right. But not a lot of people go into this as their work. You seem to have done that. Tell me about that. How did you start working with kids and addiction?
It came partially out of necessity, because I mentioned to you that as a result of the decisions that I made the last night I drank or used, I ended up with a permanent felony. Well, I have a university degree. I have years of experience in broadcasting and journalism and public relations, marketing. And you know what? Most of that became pretty much, I don't want to say worthless, but almost worthless as a result of the felony. I lost count of how many positions I applied for where I was told, sorry, we don't hire felons. And it was no longer about trying to get something related to my degree. It was just trying to get something to partially pay the bills. I was getting turned down for unskilled warehouse labor positions. So I ran into a guy, and actually in pretty odd circumstances, a gentleman by the name of Brandon. And he overheard me sharing part of my story and then sharing my frustration about, yes, I've got a felony, but I am just passionate about never being that guy again. I'm immersing myself in my recovery. Anybody that gives me a chance is going to get all of me. And Brandon heard this and he said, I'm so sorry. I don't mean to be eavesdropping on your conversation. Do you have public speaking experience? I said, I've got a bunch. He said, it kind of sounds like you have a story to tell. And I said, oh man, do I ever.
Let's go, Brandon. Let's go, Brandon.
Exactly.
I couldn't resist, dude.
And
Let's go, Brandon. Anyway, sorry.
By the way, he and I have reconnected. So this story takes place years ago. He and I actually ended up becoming friends as a result of this.
Right.
He said there's a place called Not My Kid, which I think is such a fantastic name for an organization. That's the organization that I worked for 9 years. So he said, go down there, and apply. He said, how old are you? And I was 35 at the time. And generally they hired speakers that were 18 to 25. So they would be young and hip and relatable to kids. And he said, you're kind of past their age that the organization hires, but go down there and introduce yourself, take a resume. So I went down there and I got an interview and I got another interview and I got another interview. And they wanted to hire me, but their rule was you had to be at least a year sober, which I completely get. And I was at 9 months at the time. So they said, come back when you're a year sober. I did. I started initially as a very part-time peer educator, sharing my recovery story with youth in schools. Within a few months, I was made full-time. And then a few months later, beyond that, I was made full-time staff. And I spent 9 years there. I actually just left the organization earlier this year because I wanted to branch out a little bit beyond youth mental health, but also go into adult mental health, incorporate my faith as a result of it. But that organization, Not My Kid, they gave me a chance when nobody else would. And the work that they do there, the work that I watched and I got to be a part of, was absolutely, truly life-changing. And I watched people's lives change for the better, and I watched people's lives saved. And they continue to this day. They're out there doing tremendous work. And so I will forever be grateful to them. I'm no longer with them. I'm now an independent consultant. But that is how I got into the field. And during those 9 years, I did those 600 plus speaking engagements. They gave me opportunities to go on the programs that we talked about earlier. I learned suicide intervention. I got to help run an early intervention program, peer support, trauma-informed training, you name it. And it's because of an organization that gave me a chance and said, we believe that you are who you say you are now.
That's fantastic. We'll be right back after the headlines on TNT.
Matt Boyland here with a look at your TNT headlines. Turkey has rejected condolences from the United States following the weekend's deadly terrorist attack that killed 6 people in Istanbul. A new survey has found the majority of Russian businesses have adjusted to Western sanctions and continue to operate as usual. And Japan has offered to host Australia's nuclear submarines once they are built.
The common housefly, caught in the clutches of the spider's web. Every move it makes just makes matters worse. Then, dinner time.
Feast on the captivating stories, videos, and helpful information on our website.
Whoa.
Dinner's ready.
Oh, man.
Escape is futile.
Just one more video.
Get stuck in our web.
TNTRadio.live.
Welcome back to Joseph Arthur's Technicolor Dreamcast in conversation with Shane Watson. So the organization Not My Kid, I like that name as well. Does it mean that you're helping kids that aren't your kids, I guess, just to put an obvious point.
Where the name came from, I love this because it's twofold. And actually, let me back up just a little bit. The organization was founded by a Scottsdale, Arizona family who went through a substance use issue with their own son. And they're a healthy family with loving parents and great kids. And their son was a scholar, an athlete, a student leader, and it still happened to them. So what they did is they took that old cliche of naivete, where there's parents out there that say, well, I know a lot of kids out there are using drugs, but not my kid. So they took that element of it, but then they flipped it. And the other meaning is, no, I'm not going to be that parent who's in denial. I'm going to be that parent that educates myself, that educates my child, that's involved in their life, that pays attention. And I'm going to make sure that this does not happen to us. And if I do see those signs and symptoms, I'm not going to deny it, and I'm going to take action immediately. So there's the twofold to it. It's what you don't want to be as a parent. Shane. Exactly.
Because
what you do want to be.
The thought that I had with the obvious interpretation turns out to be the least obvious, because it's also you're helping other people's kids, not my kid, even though it's not. Well, that kind of goes back onto you and being of service. Not my kid, but I'm going to be there for them anyway. So it has 3 meanings.
There's a third, exactly. You got a third element to it too. And by the way, when I used to work for them and I would wear the logo polo, and there would be random places I would end up at, and a lot of people would recognize it and they would know the organization. I did end up in a health food shop one time on my lunch hour, and the person behind the register said, "Not my kid. Is that like a, like a paternity testing place?" And I was like, "Not exactly."
That's pretty funny. Now, do you have stories? Like, I just remember being in the recovery rooms, and I spent many, many years. I should be going now. I'm sober, but I should be going. And there would always be these old timers. And of course, I started going back in the 90s, a long, long time ago. But they would always say, I threw away more beers than you drank, or whatever. It was always kind of like that. And you probably got, sort of more research to do, and all that. There was this thing about young people coming in when I first started going in, that it was like, young people, they're not ready yet, that whole thing. And you're working with these kids. Do you have success stories of actually turning children's lives around before they go off and make all those mistakes? Because there's also the theory of you have to find your bottom, and you have to kind of, like, what you went through is what people think about in finding a bottom. Like, that's a bottom, what you went through. And so your recovery, it doesn't just survive because of that bottom, but that bottom certainly helps. These kids don't hit that. Do you have success stories of that? And then do you have any stories of kids finding you when they're older and thanking you, or anything along those lines?
I love that question. I love both those questions. We saw more success stories than I can keep count of. And you're right in that, like what those old timers said in the program, which I'm not in the program anymore myself, but I know exactly what you're talking about. Yes, there is some of that element where, especially when you're dealing with teenagers, I remember being a teenager and they're convinced that they're 10 feet tall and they're bulletproof, and trying to convince them, maybe you shouldn't smoke that. Maybe you shouldn't snort that, shouldn't drink that. Sometimes that's falling on deaf ears. Having said that, I watched my colleagues work directly with kids who got the message. Now, there's plenty of them that never even started on that path, and just that prevention message, that was enough for them to hear that and go, I'm not going to make those choices. Then the kids that were in the early experimentation heard stories like mine about, here's where it can end up. And something clicked with them and they said, I don't want to do that. And so that's absolutely true that there are those ones that are, you're not going to get through to them at the time, but there are plenty of success stories. Now, as far as them reaching back out to me, I have stacks of letters that got sent to me by students, but there's one thing in particular that stands out to me, one success story. And it was when I was with the organization, and I was in charge of monitoring their general email box. So I got an email from a young lady in Australia. So not only was she not in Arizona where we were based, she's not even in the States. She reached out and she said, I'm thinking about suicide. Now, she found us because if you look up certain keyword phrases related to suicide or mental health, you will find that website. So she mentioned that she had been self-injuring. She was suicidal. I wrote back to her. I said, tell me a little bit more about your story. We went back and forth. So I'm doing an intervention. Not only is it not in person where you get the benefits of nonverbals, we're not even on the phone. We're going through email. And this goes on for a series of weeks. I find her resources in her area. I hear more about her story. I do a lot of listening, as what kind of listening you can do through email. And one day the emails just abruptly stop. And I assume, oh boy. So I write her back and I explain, hey, listen, if you're done talking to me, I completely get that. This is up to your comfort level. Just let me know that you're okay. Nothing. Silence.
Right.
I tried a few more times. And eventually I didn't have enough identifying information to, reach out to crisis in her area. She was very limited in what she would tell me. And I assumed the worst. Well, a year and a half later, I got an email from an email address at an Australian university, and it was her. And she said, I am alive today. I am thriving. I am still here because of what you did. And I printed that out and I framed it and I put it in my office. And on those really tough days when I asked myself, is this helping? Is this doing anything?
Right.
I looked at that. And that's just one example, but that was a pretty wild one right there.
I hope you wrote her back and said, how dare you not respond to my earlier email? I hope you gave her a little loving stick for that, though, amongst congratulations, obviously.
I did let her know that I was pretty scared.
Yeah, come on. It's like you could have given a brother a heads up. But that's great, dude. Seriously, that's amazing. And that is really what it's all about. It's finding that purpose of service. It really is, however you can do that. And we have an epidemic of people just droning in these purposeless lives set up that way by the media. I mean, I mentioned that Megyn Kelly piece, and it's kind of going around the whole like men out of jobs and stuff like that. And it's like they were even bringing up the fact that there wasn't stigma. She brought up the word stigma, like there needs to be stigma returned to unemployment and this kind of thing. And I was like, it's beyond that. It's beyond that there's no stigma. It's actually becoming sort of motivated and purpose driven and spiritually centered has been demonized in our society as well. So it's like these things that empower you, not only empower you to find independence and purpose, but empower you to stay alive, really. Because let's face it, the line between drifting, I mean, the devil loves drifting, as Outwitting the Devil, I think Napoleon Hill wrote that, and he talked in the interview with the devil says, drifting is my main weapon. And that's really interesting if you think about it, because it's light. It's not this like big beast that appears to you in flames and strikes you down. No, it's drifting. It's just that casual, day by day, letting it go, and we need to figure out a way to get people to work towards a dream and a vision and a purpose. But your story is full of that. The joys of service. And it's interesting that you aren't in the program anymore, though. And I'm curious as to why. I know it's kind of ropey to talk about the old program in a radio format. It's, they frown upon that. But if you don't mind going into why you've exited that a little bit, that'd be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and by us mentioning the program, we're not violating traditions. I'm not betraying anyone's anonymity, nor would I ever do that. I'm only speaking of my experience and nothing I've ever seen or heard there or anyone I've seen there. For me, it served its purpose. In the early days, I went for my first 90 days, I went every single day, and it really served a tremendous purpose. When I moved, when I started working for the organization, I was surrounded by people in recovery. And so it was, in a way, it was almost like being at a meeting all day, every day. I was constantly surrounded by people who understood what it was to be in recovery, people who understood the wild details of my old life and those stories. And that's a place where you could share one of your old stories and people wouldn't bat an eyelash. They'd be like, yeah, that sounds like me back in the day too, but we all know that we're not that person anymore. So it served its purpose, and I ended up in a place that kind of took it from there and went beyond with it. The other reason was every moment that I was there was a moment that I wasn't necessarily intervening in a suicide, or I wasn't helping a mom with her kid that was dealing with something, or I wasn't here at home spending time with my own child or my wife or my parents and people like that. And one of my biggest regrets of those years when I was drinking and using, I wasted so much time that I could have spent with people who are no longer here. And that's something that I have remedied not only since I've gotten sober, But in these last few months here, last 4 or 5 months, I have made it an even bigger priority because I lost my aunt earlier this year, who was like the linchpin of our extended family. I looked at my parents after that and I thought, how much time do I have with them? And I love them so much. And so it was a combination of reasons why I'm no longer in it. Do I advocate it for other people? Absolutely. Is it one size fits all and it's the right fit for everyone? No. And that's where I recommend things like counseling, peer support, healthy coping skills, etc.
Yeah, I love it as well. And I dip in and out. I've, only been in Arizona for 8 months, and I've gone to several of those things myself, even the time I've been here. So, it's something that it's still in my current life. But yeah, I have those same sort of oscillations with it. It is cult-like, though, in that within its philosophy, it kind of says, if you veer away and say what you're saying, well, you must be on a dry drunk. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. So, and I forgive its cultishness in that realm, because it really does need to sort of hammer home to people who are in early days that they need to keep coming back and all that. So anyway, I hope we haven't crossed any lines and they're going to get angry emails, but we'll be right back with Shane Watson after these words on TNT.
De-weaponizing weather with reality and perspective.
Of course, you always hear me signing off with enjoy the weather. It's the only weather you got. And that's because I'd like to be a happy warrior, not warrior, as far as anything goes with the weather or climate or whatever. But the problem is that there are too many questions out there. Now, people look at me and say, oh, you're a conspiracy nut. There's no questions, it's settled science, right? Well, this is very interesting, because if we go back to that Tonga volcano that went off in January this past year, the first thing it did, was because it was an underwater volcano initially, was heat the water up. And when the water gets heated up and it gets spread out, we saw all that warm water get into the North Pacific. What do you think happens to the global temperature? But what do you think happens later when all the ash that was in the air starts taking effect? Well, guess what the global temperature is doing now? It's dropping quite quickly. So we got to keep an eye on this. Hey, I may not have the answers, but I got some questions. Enjoy the weather. It's the only weather you got. This is meteorologist Joe Bastardi, your climate and weather watchdog for TNT.
Challenging the consensus and debunking the narrative. This is Viewpoint.
Several countries and automakers have pledged to end the sale of combustion engine cars by 2035. Electric cars are intended to take over, and this is supposed to be green. The transition to electric vehicles would require batteries galore, and therefore the biggest expansion of mining that the world has seen. Tailings from mines contaminate much wider regions, including major rivers, lakes, and the oceans. It takes 500,000 gallons of water to mine 1 ton of lithium, and farmers left without a drop are forced out. Lithium-ion batteries used in electric cars are difficult and costly to recycle, and it's cheaper just to mine more lithium. Significant quantities of plastic, aluminium, rubber, and particularly iron are required for electric cars, just as any other car. Massive new charging station infrastructure will again require more resources. Is this really green?
How's the dollar against the peso or the euro? For a favorable rate of exchange and the currency of free speech, listen to today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
Welcome back to Joseph Arthur's Technicolor Dreamcast with Shane Watson right now. So Shane, how do people get into what you're doing? I mean, how do people become of service in this realm? And you're doing work with kids and adults alike. Where do people start if they want to find purpose the way that you have?
I would look at reaching out to local prevention organizations, reaching out to local youth mental health related organizations, substance use coalitions, places like that. And also I would recommend, there's a training that you can take for people who are not, they don't have a master's in counseling. They're not a psychologist. They're not a licensed clinician. There are states that are now letting you take trainings to become a peer support specialist. And so you are someone who, especially if you're coming out of lived experience, what they can do is train you to be what's called a paraprofessional. As I mentioned earlier, you're not a counselor, you're not a clinician, you're not a therapist, but you are that frontline worker. And you might be that first friendly face that person that's in the midst of addiction or suicidal thoughts or dealing with body image issues or eating disorders, the first person that sees them, that they see, that says to them, I see what you're going through. And I can tell you firsthand, it can and will get better. Why don't the two of us sit down? I want to listen to your story and let's figure out a plan together. And so it's going to be organizations like that. It's the willingness to go in there and be vulnerable and take that time and do that. There is such a huge need right now for any type of individuals in mental and behavioral health support positions. We are in the midst of a heck of a battle. And you referenced it earlier. It is a spiritual battle. And I 100% believe that as well. So for those individuals out there who are listening to this, who are connected to a faith community, your faith community might also be the place where you look at some kind of opportunity like this as well, because I'm encouraged to say, more and more faith communities are starting to open up the conversation about mental health and not sweeping it under the rug.
That's good. I definitely think you have to be an addict in recovery to really, really help. I mean, that could be controversial, and tell me if you disagree. I mean, Dr. Drew is an example that comes to mind. I'm a fan. I like Dr. Drew. I think he's a net positive for humanity, and he's, but when he talks about recovery, me as somebody who's just been through it, I know he doesn't really know what he's talking about. You know what I mean? And that's where the program really sort of sets the standard. When two or more drunks meet, that's a meeting. It's like, I don't know, man. It's a look in somebody's eye. It's just the way they communicate about it. If they've been there, you can talk somebody off the ledge. If somebody hasn't been there, it's much more difficult. Is that true, or am I getting that wrong?
You know that they get you. There are people out there that have qualifications academically, professionally, way beyond anything that I have. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for them. And honestly, I wish I had gone and gotten my master's, and someday, time and money allowing it, I would go do that. But you are correct. There is a power in being able to say to someone, I know what that feels like. And there was a treatment facility in Phoenix that I went to a number of years ago called Calvary Center. It's still around, fantastic place. And every single one of the counselors, when I was there, with one exception, was an individual in recovery as well. And my counselor was an old biker dude who had actually gone out and gotten his counseling license. So he knew the ins and outs of it, and he understood it from a professional standpoint. But he was a guy that was like, you knew that he had lived it. So if you shared something with him and you were like, with a normie, if you shared it, you're like, man, am I going to be judged? You knew this guy was going to get it.
Yeah,
and that fear of judgment is what keeps people. Fear of judgment is what.
Yeah, it's like your story to me. Like, you tell me that story, I don't judge it at all, because I've been through addiction. I know what it's like to be blacked out and completely out of your mind, and to have driven your life to the point where you drove your life. I've driven my life not to the same point, but to points, I'm sure, beyond that, or, in ways, and then not beyond it in other ways. Like, I've never attempted my own life. So obviously in that regard, but I don't judge it. I get it, and I think as much empathy as a non-addict can muster, there's gonna be like, they won't understand why you did that to yourself to the same degree a fellow addict will, because to have battled addiction, then that throws out all the judgment. So let's talk a little bit about Arizona, because Arizona is so huge in the news. It seems like the city is expanding like crazy. I moved here from New York 8 months ago to get away from it all. And I moved right into the hot button place of the whole world, dude. What did I do? I'm here in Arizona. This is where everybody wants to be. This is the spot. How did I do that? Now tell me how it's going here in your view. I saw this big homeless encampment on the media in Phoenix yesterday, a really sad story about a dead baby they discovered, and then people in the comment section saying it's turning blue. And of course, we have this controversial election now. Everybody's spinning out about. What's your take on the changes going on in Phoenix, Arizona, and Maricopa County?
I attribute much of it to an influx from California. I have lived in this state my entire life. I love this state. There are incredible people here. There is an amazing culture here, multiple cultures that make up our culture. And there's no place that I would rather live. I've been all over the US. I've been to Mexico, Spain, and France, and this is home. But this is no longer the state that I once knew. Without me getting too deep into politics, I will admit that I am troubled right now. I have a lot of questions. I'm just troubled by the state in general.
Right.
And, you mentioned very, very early on in our conversation, and we didn't really get into this, but you mentioned fentanyl.
Let's go there.
We are a primary hub for the Sinaloa cartel.
Right.
Drugs hit our state first before they are then marked up by middlemen and then dispersed throughout the country. So they get here quicker, in larger quantities, and cheaper. And I have worked directly with parents who have lost wonderful, beautiful, amazing children to fentanyl overdoses from fake pills here in the state of Arizona. 3 milligrams will kill you. And I'm not seeing it getting any better. And it astounds me when I hear people talk about wanting things to get better, and I'm not seeing actions that accompany those claims. And that really concerns me, not only as someone that's lived here my whole life, but you talk about a change in perspective, being a dad and looking at my little girl and saying, is this the right place for us to raise a family right now? And I don't know. Dude, I honestly don't know the answer to that question right now.
I mean, child trafficking here too. I have a 1 and almost half-year-old, like a baby. And we didn't know that child trafficking was as prevalent here as it is when we moved here, or we would not have moved here. I mean, we both have talked about that after the fact, and we love it here, man. We are like, oh my God, we love this place. We miss New York. I miss New York, but I love it here. I'm psyched that we're here, except for that. And fentanyl as well, of course, but child trafficking, when you have a baby, it's even more spooky,
It changes your perspective on everything. If someone has a child and it doesn't change the way they view everything, that would trouble me. And by the way, you mentioned child trafficking and then also human trafficking in general. Sometime check out an organization. It's a local organization called Red Light Rebellion. It's a husband and wife team, and they educate here in Arizona on human trafficking. And it is troubling how prevalent it is specifically in this state. So you raised another one of the issues that, looking specifically at Arizona, is really concerning. There's multiple ones, but we've touched on a couple of the ones that tend to end up toward the top of the list.
And that's why I really wanted Carrie Lake, because she was addressing this stuff in her campaign. She was calling it out by name and intended to battle it, So, and you don't have to get all political or say anything on that, but I was bummed. and am bummed about that because, yeah, fentanyl, it's the number one cause of death between 18 and 44-year-olds, over 100,000 in the last 12 months. It's an epidemic. It's one of the main issues in America right now. And this state is, like you said, it's where it's all rushing into.
Yeah. And, among the countless reasons why I am grateful that I got sober and got into recovery when I did is the fact that, the drugs I was using were concerning enough back when I was using them.
Dude.
But now
I would have been dead.
You may think you're getting cocaine or MDMA.
Dude, I would have been dead.
Absolutely. 100 times over. And so I look at one of those things. I look at how many times I could have been dead. I look at the fact that I would be if I was still using now. And those are the things that
gotta go, Shane. We only got 30 seconds left.
Right
the music never kicked in. It didn't. Man, you are brilliant, Shane. I would love to have you back. We're gonna talk again after this.
Anytime.
Man, you are awesome, Shane Watson. Thank you for coming on. Peace out. We'll see you guys real soon. We'll be on again right after these words with Karen Hunt on TNT.